Hi. Thank you, everyone. It's not a very long presentation. I'll just try to summarize what we have been working since the last PI. Uh, so, Primarily, what is our overarching objective in this work stream? Uh, we all know that Moja Loop supports transfer of funds, and uh, those funds transfer are initiated from payer DFSP, and also a model whereby a third party can initiate payments or transfers. But our goal is that we adopt Moja Loop wherever possible for merchant payments. So technically, a transfer and a payment both mean value, movement of value from a payer DFSP to a pay DFSP, or in our context, we call it a merchant DFSP. But compared to a transfer, a payment also means that there is a delivery of service or goods involved, and thus when we started exploring what are the gaps or what are the areas which we need to look into to enable the utilization of Moja Loop as a payment system that supports merchant payments in real world. So the contextual information is quite important, that the contextual information is captured and passed on to support various ancillary processes. For example, fraud and risk monitoring, or primarily dispute resolution. So if I have made a payment and there is a problem between the payer and payee, then certain information which can travel between those two institutions and could be useful in the dispute resolution process. So with that in mind, we actually started looking at what does merchant payments or payments in general entail. So there are three areas where we were looking at. First, there's the scope, where what type of payments we are looking at. The second was that what type of channels people are going to use, both the customer and the merchant. So whether it's a USSD feature phone or a smartphone where you can scan QR codes. So those are the type of channels. Then one more important aspect is about the merchant segment, that what kind of merchants we are looking at. And I'll come to that in the next few slides, that what kind of merchants are we looking to design for. And then there are several ancillary components which will be required or to be added in the future. So we wrote high-level user stories for all of these areas, and we quickly realized during this PI that we can't cover all of them in one go. So we have a lot of user stories written for ancillary components like dispute resolution system, and then within the type of payments, we did some exploration that at a high level, we are dividing the payments into either customer-initiated push payments or request to pay, or a proximity payment or an online payment, or an invoice or bill-based payment. So there are several types of use cases within the payments that we need to look into. And each use case has its own nuance, which will require some brainstorming. So to make sure that we are focusing on a particular use case, we have narrowed down ourselves to looking at proximity payment for a small merchant by a customer who is either using their feature phone for USSD or smartphone using QR codes. And in order to do the implementation, we worked on primarily in this particular PI on a component for merchants. So within Moja Loop documentation, we see that there is a central oracle for merchant registry. So we have done some work around that in this PI, which I'll explain. and how that merchant registry would integrate with ALS, and then an end-to-end payment transaction. How does that flow happen? And then future extensions would be around the work related to dispute management, request to pay, how to handle somewhat complex or very complex merchants as opposed to a small merchant, and a PISP model. So yeah, so basically our work which is related to the merchant component, what we have built as a central component or looking to build is the merchant registry. And so initially we started with the word merchant registry, but as things evolved, we have divided that into two parts. One is a merchant acquirer system, which is kind of a hosted central hub component, which can be offered as an add-on service by the hub operator. And it serves as the registration point for merchants. And within that, we'll support both self-registration, where a merchant can choose to register themselves and link up with one of the DFSPs who is offering merchant payment services, or they can be registered by the DFSP themselves as well. And in our data model or the design model, we are conscious of the fact that a merchant can have relationships with multiple DFSPs at the same time, but may choose to use one of them for their alias as a default DFSP. Then this merchant registry component, we thought that it should capture all the essential merchant information, which later can be used for fraud and risk management. So whenever we are designing fraud and risk management systems in future, if they are talking to the hub, then both the data about the merchant, their profile, and the transactional data, both are important. And this registry can serve as the data source for that as well. And this acts as an oracle for an alias also, which can be used as a unique identifier to identify a discrete merchant in proximity payments. So I earlier talked about a simple merchant or a small merchant. So how do we define simple, somewhat complex, or very complex? Is that you can have a simple merchant. Example is a hawker on a street, or a small shop which has one location and which is the default checkout counter when it comes to proximity payment. And then we have got a somewhat complex scenario where you have got one location and with multiple checkouts, or maybe a very complex scenario with multiple locations and multiple checkouts. Eventually, why these are different scenarios? Because when we especially look at payment via a USSD phone, the person who is going to pay at that checkout counter, it's important for them that when they make the payment, if it's a complex merchant where there are multiple checkout counters or multiple locations, the funds may move into a single account or different accounts depending on the merchant's choice. But it's important that the person sitting behind the counter gets the notification. So with that in mind, we also designed the data model so that registry can help with that. Although the DFSPs who will be serving the merchants, they are responsible to do that notification part. But as I will take you through the diagrams, you will see how we have thought about it. And then it's designed to be flexible for online payments as well. And lastly, the important point is that the merchant should have the flexibility so they can request if they want to switch their same alias from one DFSP to another. And this is important because if, for example, we have a Modulo enabled merchant payment scheme and people have deployed QR codes, then I don't want them to change the QR codes every time they want to change a DFSP. So things like that should be enabled. what this merchant registry would not be doing is that it won't be storing any financial information or fee or contract related information for merchant. That is a domain which still remains with the DFSP as to how much they are charging the merchant any fee for the services. So at a high level, the architecture looks like this, that we have got Mojo Loop, we have got ALS, and the component which we were earlier calling merchant registry now has got two separate components. One is the acquirer system, and the other is a merchant registry. So acquirer system is that centralized hosted data repository which will provide a user interface and a data store for the DFSPs who don't have their own in-house merchant management systems. So this helps to onboard the merchants as well as also self-registry will be enabled through this. And once the merchant is goes through some approval process, then the data is pushed into registry, which keeps the record of aliases. And this acts as an oracle. So if if I want to pay to a merchant and I put their alias, then this registry is the one which resolves that which DFSP this merchant belongs to. And then that DFSP will get the get parties call. So we created a number of documents which will illustrate how we have thought through. So this is our repository for merchant payments where we have created all the documents so merchant can have relationship with multiple acquirers. Merchant can have their own self-managed acquiring or hosted merchant acquiring. So this context is where the merchants are hosted on this platform. This is the whole overview of a registration process where a small merchant will come with an application to the DFSP outside the system, and then the DFSP has got a maker and checker who can use the acquiring system to import the records or punch in the records. And once they put the data, it's stored, and then checker will perform some KYB process. And after doing that KYB process, they will approve the data. And once this data is approved, this goes into the merchant registry system. And this merchant registry system can have multiple options. One is where the alias is already allocated or provided by the DFSP. So in that case, if the alias is provided, it checks that it's a unique alias and confirms. If no alias is provided, then it can also generate an alias and provide back. And once all this process is completed, the DFSP user knows that the merchants are registered with such and such alias, and they can take this data back into their internal systems so that when there is a call for alias resolution, a get parties call, they can service that call. Similarly, we have got this end-to-end process for payment. So what will happen over here that once the customer comes to a merchant, we are calling this alias pay into ID over here. So let's say it's a till number or something like that. And there is an account associated with that, but that account is the data which is captured by the DFSP. So the registry is keeping this data. It's not capturing the bank account number. That data resides with the DFSP. We have got the DFSP ID, the merchant ID, alias, name of the merchant, location, and all of this data was captured during the onboarding process and then taken by the DFSP to keep this alias account mapping in their system. We had like one point where we were considering that if we could also keep the resolution of the till number or the counter over here, but due to the current design of how Mojo Loop works, we had to make sure that the call is resolved by the FSP and not by the registry itself. So the customer over here, it gives the alias. And in future, where we have scenarios where one merchant can have multiple checkout counters, they will need to provide this till number or checkout counter number, which is captured by the pair DFSP. So this is the standard get parties call, which comes to the Mojo Loop switch, and it routes the call to merchant registry, which knows that this is the DFSP. So it will return the DFSP ID and merchant ID, all the data. There is an extension list into get participants call, so we'll use that to deliver some of the data. And then there's a get parties call to the DFSP where it returns the party information, and it goes to the pair DFSP, which will show to the customer and then do the transfer process as a standard process. So we have also designed for the complete detailed design for the ER diagram for the data model for the merchant registry. So essentially, a lot of thought process went into this because what we are trying to capture is a level of detail which is also aligned with the message formats or the standards as well in future. So for example, as I said, that we are designing for the complex scenarios as well. So one merchant can have one or more owners, one or more contact person. They could have multiple locations. And while designing for the locations, we tried to keep it in alignment with the ISO 222 standards. Similarly, this is all the contextual information which gets captured here in the registry. The licenses related information. So all of this can be used as a hosted merchant registry, merchant acquiring system by the DFSPs. And the idea is that in the markets where we are implementing Mojo Loop for merchant payments, if this component is a add-on overlay service, which is provided by the hub operator, that could be useful for swift onboarding of the merchants. Earlier in sequence diagrams, we have visualized also the mockups for them. Hello. So this will be something like this, that you put the business information and then all the location related information. Right now it will be single location, then it can be multiple locations. Similarly, owner related information, contact person. So all of these data which is captured in that data model. So the merchant will be first data will be entered by a maker, and then some checker will validate it, and then they will get alias issued. And there were certain design considerations while doing that. So merchant registry is kept as a separate component, so it can publish standard interfaces. Initially, our implementation would be that the DFSP who wants to provide merchant services will be using both the acquiring system and the registry, but they can also have their own acquiring system from which they can push data to the registry. So it's not necessary that all of the DFSPs are using the acquiring system. And the merchant will be provided through this acquiring system a way that they can request to change their DFSP, which the other DFSP has to approve then. So the user interface which I was showing you, these are the type of users in that. So there will be hub users whose role is to do the user and role management. They'll enable or disable DFSPs in the portal system. They can view all the merchant records, do data extracts, all of that. The DFSP users, they will be actually uploading the merchant records or putting them in manually if they want to do that input. They will validate their own merchants as well as the self-registered merchants. So if a merchant does a self-registration on this portal, then their application goes to a DFSP user who will then approve that. Similarly, a merchant can log in and use this portal to register. They can get their QR codes, their aliases directly from the portal. They can change their DFSP or check the status of registration. And if there is any KYC information, so the prototype which I was showing. So our next steps is now that we plan to complete the design of this. And the design is largely the work is done, but we are going through. We went through one review with the design authority team, and we'll do another one after a few weeks. So we'll finalize the design and then do test case planning, functional, security, and performance tests, which will then lead to development and testing of this component. There are other use cases which we have to design for, and during this whole process, a lot of things came up. For example, when we think of online payments, in proximity payments, it's very natural to think of how a USSD-based customer will pay, because the identifier which they are paying to is not a transaction identifier, it's a merchant identifier, an alias which points to a discrete merchant. But when it comes to online payments, the user experience is such that when I'm paying online, and let's say if I'm paying using USSD, then I need to point to that transaction so that I can get a completion message on the screen. So we are going to discuss this within the group, how online payments can be done using USSD. And then there are, we had certain number of discussions around bill or invoice-based payments, where it's important that the exact amount has to be paid, or certain amount is paid before due date or after due date. So those kind of scenarios, how we are going to capture. And finally, the request to pay use case. So those are the next steps which we are planning to work on.
I fielded a few questions for you, Kareem, as you were going through, but there was a last comment from Miller. Adopters will have local requirements for registering merchants, ID, e.g. national ID, SIM, MISPIN, etc. I don't know if you can see that question. I think we covered a few of those in the ERD. It got a very complicated ERD very quickly when you consider all the permutations we have to work through. The number of optional fields becomes quite scary quite quickly. I don't know if you want to just drop back to the ERD just a moment, see if we've missed any of those, just as a quick heads up. But a lot of the documentation is including those, including business licenses, if they exist, etc.
Yeah, I guess my comment isn't that you should make a union of all the possible things. It's actually quite a different statement, which is you shouldn't do any of it. You should shove it into a local adopter specific table that is joined through a foreign key to the core data that we actually need to do whatever it is that we do.
Got you.
So even things like license number and license document length, you'll never get that right. So if you start thinking about what is actually needed by the system and what is likely to be needed by a scheme or by an individual participant for retrieval later, those kinds of things could be exemplary in a implementation, but you would make it very clear that they sit outside of the core and won't be serviced by us, but we'll make sure that we maintain them. So for example, we would assume that there is such a table, even if there's nothing in it. And we would make sure that all of our queries, joins, reports, and everything else are made in such a way that data that resided in that table could be incorporated including in responses to messages and during the agreement phase. But but we don't depend on it, and we would make that clear. So if you then service Mojo Loop later with the new release, you could literally drop the release in. It would make no difference to what you've done in your magic table off on the side. But if people start whacking on the core schema, they're going to quickly get to a point where they can't take a release. They will have forked it without even knowing it.
Yeah. No, it's a very valid comment. Although we try to keep it flexible as much as possible. So like if a business has one or multiple owners, then the type of identification could be parameterized according to the local context. But there will be extensions. I think it's a good idea that we define that if someone wants to extend this data model, then what's the proper way to do it. So if they want to link up into other data sources or do the validations, obviously we can't do everything under the sun, but if someone wants to extend, then how do they do it? Like in our country where I come from, whenever I'm onboarding someone as an owner, this national ID, there's an API to validate it from the ID authority. So something like standard extensions we can think through.
Yeah, but again, I guess what I'm getting at is that even this level of stuff, you should start with, why do we need it? Do we really need to have that kind of ID for the business owner? Or do we assume that that kind of information would be useful to a scheme and we're trying to accommodate it? Those are different things and they sit on different sides of the fence. And I think if we start opinionating too much about what the scheme will want, we'll get it wrong. I would say that you could certainly test, once you have a basic idea of the split between those things, what do we absolutely require and what could be joined in by a deployer, you could test the theory by evaluating, for instance, what was done by Tanzania for their merchant system that they've deployed, and others that have done something similar where those specifications might be available, at least sensitively to you for the purposes of validating this. I feel like getting the split right would be really important.
Yeah, thanks. Noted.
You also hit onto another challenge, and where we got into was the merchant acquirer platform, where some companies do not even have that basic as a DFSP. And I think that fits squarely into the what's required at the switch did start to become quite a regular topic that we had, which is one of the debates of how do you cope if there's no merchant acquirer system, and how do you offer a service for those parties, because they need to capture all the information to do their KYB checking. But you're right, then what comes down to what's required by the switch is a subset of all of that. How do we simplify that is where we got to at the end of the PI, and we're finalizing. So we probably need to come back with you, Manila, and just vet some ideas as well, I think, once we've got through that final step.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to get involved in this too, at least at a review level, and I'll be as helpful as I can be. I do think that getting experience from, for example, the BCEAO that is bringing their system up in the fall of this year, they may become ready to discuss some of this more openly with the open source community. Tanzania, and the same thing with their system. Their merchant registry is done. Their TAN-QR is spec'd and deployed. So they've made a lot of choices. And one thing we've discovered is that the choices made in Tanzania, for example, for their QR code contents are dramatically different than those that were made by BCEAO. And yet both are very competent static plus dynamic QR code specifications. But because of what's in the QR code, there's a quite different set of stuff sitting in the merchant registry. And so then you kind of beg the question of, well, obviously I have a QR code. I didn't actually need that information. And yet there it is. It's showing up in this particular environment because the deployer required it. And that's what I'm really trying to tease out, is you almost need to have 2 data points at least or more to figure out what's common among them and what looks like something the switch could depend on that would have to be everywhere versus that would kind of flow to deployers. Over.
I don't see any other comment or question. There are a couple of comments. I think it's from Rob. Paul, you had a question each still has its own QR code. So with USSD, I mean, earlier what we were trying to see that in a multi-till environment, ideally the customer does not need to provide this till number. But we could not figure out a way to do that until and unless, because the challenge is that when we do this get parties call to the switch, the way it is designed right now is that it goes to the merchant registry, let's say, and even if this extension data we are returning, this next call, which is get parties call, it cannot carry that data back. So if we had kept, let's say, a counter ID, earlier we were thinking that one alias should be for one particular checkout counter, but we had to revert back to one alias belongs to one discrete merchant, because in this point the data cannot get back, the counter ID cannot get back to the customer, the paired DFSP. So we had to change this design that if there is a till number, and if someone is paying via USSD, then they will probably need to punch in that till number separately. But if it's a QR, then that QR can capture both the alias and till number and send it back to the merchant DFSP, enabling the merchant DFSP to exactly notify that particular till that the payment has been completed. This will be important in context where we have got complex merchants or multi-checkout counter situation.
Kareem, can I clarify one thing? Then the way we use the term till number in deployments is generally a globally unique number that uniquely identifies a pay point, and that it is associated on the back end with a particular merchant. But the till number itself does not require you to tell me who the merchant is. It is actually a unique value that is used that you can pay. And so the till number ends up becoming the thing that you spray paint on the side of a cart for USSD members, or that you would include in other contexts where you can't use a QR code, a barcode, or where you're not doing something of that kind. That doesn't mean that you can't pay a merchant by using the merchant alias, but that there's a till number is a specific thing. It's a namespace controlled environment that is independent of DFSP, for instance. So a private acquiring agreement wouldn't allow you to make up any till number you want. You have to go through the registry to get the unique value. And there might be rules about magic values that are really well known and useful that are preserved, and versus those that are not. And of course, you want to keep them short. So the whole thing around till number is it's actually an ID form, and whether you allow a merchant to have more than one till number is a question of the scheme rules, and how they would allocate those might be by block. So the till number might end with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 9, whatever, or it might have 2 digits at the end to allow for multiple lanes in a larger store. But that is really the thing that I think you're calling the merchant alias. These things are somewhat bundled together, but I think the terminology is going to be confusing. Michael, or maybe somebody else who worked on M-Pesa, could probably jump in here on how they use those terms. Anyway, over. Michael is not with us right now.
No, he is here. Sorry, I am here, but not yet in a position to make a constructive contribution to the debate.
No worries.
Sorry, I just cycled down from my house to the hotel. So.
Oh, well, that's awesome. Yeah, no, the question was around the use of the word till number, where I think in the M-Pesa and mobile money environment, that generally is a unique number that is used independent of other things to identify the point of payment. And the merchant ID is something that might be used at the scheme level to identify a merchant who might in fact have more than one till. But that the till number was a thing that was managed carefully. And it was originally a proprietary value issued by M-Pesa. And now there's the idea that these are now scheme allocated. So you can have some portability between providers when you move around. I'm not sure if I covered the nature of this dichotomy. You might have other thoughts on it.
I think that those, what you say about the till numbers and the relationship between till numbers and merchant numbers is, I think, correct. But I think that they are not portable. And that if in a mobile money system, if someone moves to a different provider, then they will get a completely different set of, it's a completely different merchant ID and a completely different set of till numbers, which is why when you go into a coffee shop or whatever in Kenya, you see 4 or 5 stickers up on the wall saying if you're paying by your merchant ID, if you're paying via Tigo Pay, here's your merchant ID, and so on.
Yeah, I think that's the point we were making, was that we want in a Moja Loop environment to enable the value of portable till IDs. It's one of the L1P principles. But I think if we get back to the actual deployers and look at what Tanzania's done, they've done just this. They've said you have to migrate to a scheme, TIPS essentially, allocated till number, but they had some way of preserving old till numbers. I don't remember exactly how they did it, so that you clearly have millions of them in the market already. So how do you have people be able to execute against that during the transition period? It would be useful to have somebody from Tanzania talk to that. I don't want to imagine it for them, but there was something they had to go through there. But I think they're getting to the point where you have a till number that's issued by the scheme, and that it then is portable. So it allows for more competition.
Miriam?
Sorry, I got disconnected earlier. So we actually, this is exactly the point where we had a lot of discussion and debate. And in an ideal world, I would like a customer to enter a single number which identifies both the merchant and the exact counter where they are paying, so that the person sitting behind the counter can get the notification. Our challenge was that if we go into the data model, although the registry holds, like we can issue a single alias per checkout counter instead of per merchant. But then that value will have to still go to the PISP in order to get resolved. So we can look into this part again, whether for USSD customers, what we are calling as a merchant identifier, is it discretely identifying just the merchant, or also it can identify the checkout counter?
That'd be great if you could look into it. And it won't change the requirement that ultimately the PISP has to say that till number is legal, it's live, even if you had them discrete. And of course, if they are all bundled together as one item, one number, then they still have to look at it and say, yes, that I know who that is and I can process it. It's the second part of address resolution. That doesn't change. So it seems to me that exactly what you said before, rather than modifying the protocols to carry around these separate things, it would be easier to figure out a way to work within that confine, while also hoping to maintain the ability for portable till numbers to be a real thing in the future, which is really a function of the merchant registry to support that allocation and retirement and reallocation of till numbers over time. But recognizing, as Michael pointed out, that the history comes from a different place, which is the till numbers were assigned by the DFSPs. And there has to be some way to manage that namespace, which is complicated. I very much applaud your effort, though, to get to this point and recognize that this is a real thing. And we do have to figure out how to do this. And I do want us to reflect on what was done, at least at present, by Tanzania, what's coming out from BCAO, and what we're anticipating for Rwanda, so that we can come to a essentially market-based recommendation for how this would go forward that maximizes benefit to the end users. Or
Elaine, I think that you have a question as well.
Yeah, no. So I just wanted to comment on that. We actually already here in Rwanda, we already have some merchants that are actually using multiple merchant codes, which in this case is what we are referring to as a till number. So basically, the same merchant, like a large supermarket that has multiple counters, and we are basically paying on different merchant codes, even though it is the same merchant. So we basically already have that case on the ground here in Rwanda. So I think what Karim is saying here would apply for some of the large merchants in Rwanda.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I think, if there is any other question I can answer. Innocent,
a question from me.
you have a question. Are those basically what we call sub-merchants? We are not using the term sub-merchants as such. In our model, we are just saying, so there's another level of complexity, probably because our focus was on small merchant right now, which we have not. But later on, when we go into a complex merchant design, where there's a chain store which has got multiple outlets or multiple locations. Sometimes it's a franchisee model where different locations have their different owners, but they are grouped into one at some level. So we'll go into that level of detail probably in next sprint.
Well, Karim, the other thing too is that while we're doing the business analysis and then we're reflecting that here, we should be somewhat cautious and remember that the end user doesn't understand any of that. They want to pay a pay point. It's like when you go to an ATM, you get money out of it. You're not really thinking about the ownership structure of why that ATM exists and what wallet's stuck in. You just get money out of it. And I think we want to do the same kind of thing here. Say, does the end user actually need or care about this distinction? And if they don't, then we really don't need to collect that information from them. So if we have to collect it because we can't figure out how to model it differently, that's a flag. And we should probably think that through a little bit. We don't want to enforce the sort of business analysis view onto the end customer if we don't have to, even though exactly as Alain was saying that the large merchants may have 15 lanes per location. They might say, oh, well, I want the location code. And then I also want a till code. And I also want they want lots of stuff. But if we can get back to where there's a way for them to register the pay points in the system so that they can be found and the correct accounting can be made at their level, then I think then we would succeed. So you probably need to model what you have, but I don't think we necessarily have to have the end user enter it directly. That's the test. I don't have a solution for you, but that there's something there.
Yeah.
Can I just add something to that, Miller?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that the fact that it's a DFSP itself that makes the mapping between the identifier and the account number means that the presence of multiple merchant IDs, for instance, each representing a lane in a supermarket, doesn't at all mean that all the funds paid into those different merchant IDs won't wind up in the same merchant's account.
Yeah, well said. I mean, it really becomes a scheme issue as to how many IDs do I allow a merchant to have, and how many IDs do I force the end user to try to memorize when they're paying in a particular store. It's like those two things there's a tension there that I think you can resolve. But even if you said there's no relationship, there's just 15 of them, they'll look different, it works fine. And as you say, Michael, they could all pay into a common merchant account, and you wouldn't have to care about that as an end user.
Yeah, that's the reason we went to the pay into ID rather than the merchant alias, because of that challenge of merchants actually having regional banks as well. So I might want for a region of a country to have all of my outlets paying into one bank account, and in another region, another bank account. So there's a whole bunch of dynamic components that we've tried to map into the model, which is why we tried to extract the pay into ID instead of using the term merchant ID, because, well, which merchant ID are we referring to? The merchant store, the merchant region, the merchant itself, a subsidiary of that there's a whole bunch of complexity that starts spiraling out. And then if you start layering on, oh, what about franchisees? How do they fit into this ecosystem? There's a whole bunch of things that we've tried to put into the model, and anybody having a look at it, we would really appreciate feedback, because the more people that look at this, the more dimensions we can ensure we've tried to cover.
I think that's great. And I think looking at the different users of the system and ensuring that one user's needs don't swamp over the others, if there's a way for the scheme to provide a intermediate solution, as you've said here, in the case for the merchant, they can present themselves one way to the market while hiding their accounting nonsense to themselves, which way they want to do that. They've got flexibility there in how they register in. And of course, ultimately, you want this to be as simple as possible. When you see some of the information we get out of the numeracy and literacy levels of some of the users of the mobile money systems, you don't want to demand a lot of conceptual understanding, even of things like, well, this is the same store except you're in a different lane now. Won't occur to most people. And you do get to that level of consequence. So being simple at that level, but being able to reflect the complexity of the merchant environment, all the way down to, as you say, the simple merchant on the street, but then up to the supermarket level, I think is important. I'm glad you've gone to this level, though, of reflecting this. And that's the test, though, I think will apply each time we go through it is, did we really capture what we need? But also, did we not then impose too much information capture on the end party, whoever that is, merchant or consumer or business to business and so forth? But thank you.
Sure. Thank you for all this feedback. Simeon, I'm done. So I'll share the presentation, and it has got links to our document repo, so anyone can give feedback.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Karim. Again, for everyone who's curious about the presentation, all the slide decks are in this link on GitHub. All the presenters are under instructions to put all their decks in there, so feel free to pop in. And the recordings of this, of each of the sessions, will be up on YouTube fairly soon. So you'll be able to follow and review all this material once again. So